And the situation of human rights in China was the focus of the European Parliament on Thursday as well. In particular, politicians and NGOs called for action to stop the forced organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience.
China's organ transplant industry has grown rapidly over the past decade, but the source of organs used for transplants has remained controversial. That's particularly after 2006, when allegations surfaced that state hospitals were killing persecuted Falun Gong practitioners for their organs. The issue was raised on Thursday in Brussels during a hearing of the European Parliament's Human Rights Subcommittee.
So in other words, individuals in China, completely against their will, have their organs harvested, and in the process of that, they die. So this is the issue that I think will be discussed further. There are many groups that these may be of groups of individuals where these organs might be taken from, the Falun Gong being one of the main groups.
Similar hearings were held in the European Parliament in 2006 and 2009. The Chinese regime has since admitted that executed prisoners are the main source of organs. Independent investigations suggest they are not just prisoners, but prisoners of conscience, and many went through no legal conviction.
I've met someone myself whose best friend died in prison. He disappeared one evening from the cell, and when he next saw his friend's body, it had holes in it in the prison hospital, and he thought some operation had been done, but obviously what had happened was he'd been transplanted, he'd been harvested for his organs.
Canadian human rights lawyer and Nobel Peace Prize nominee David Matas co-authored a book on the forced organ harvesting allegations. It includes dozens of pieces of data and concludes that at least thousands of Falun Gong practitioners have been killed for their organs. The hearing, attended by EU officials, politicians, and human rights advocates, called on the European Parliament to take concrete action to help end organ harvesting.
I believe that we have to think about new legislation, which would be extraterritorial, which would be international, and which would simply require individual responsibility of all people involved in these operations, in these absolutely criminal, illegal activities. So this would send a very strong message to China.
Thank you. Now we come to our hearing on the human rights in China. It is the second hearing this year, and we also are working in the Parliament on a Parliament's report on China, and Mr. Belder is the rapporteur. And I have to say that we work on all our strategic partners on the human rights situation there. We are not selective. We have hearings and exchanges with all the different countries, and so we have it with China also. We are, when we're reflecting on how we can do human rights better within the EU institution, the reflection on the EU human rights dialogue, for example, with China, is also in other reports and in other debates on our agenda, because we really have to find the best ways to get that our work contributes to improvements of human rights violations and the human rights situation in China. Now, we also tried in the Human Rights Committee now for several years to send a delegation to China and to discuss with the authorities and with civil society there. But so far we were not successful. So I visited China last month, and it was very interesting, and I think it is still a subject which we in the enlarged bureau said we will continue to try to get an invitation from the Chinese authorities to go to China in the coming year. Now, it's a very long list always of different human rights violations which are on the agenda in China. So we have to find a way, in the most meaningful way, when we have sessions, to address on some issues more in detail. And I tried for arranging for this meeting to find a way to do this. And we will have two experts with us. Mr. Dr. Yang Jianli. He will focus on how the political, how can I say, let me say, he will focus on the, no, it's not here. So can we show the video?
The Human Rights Day is coming. First of all, I'd like to express my gratitude to the people around the world who have shown great concern for China's freedom, human rights, rule of law, democracy, and social justice. Thank you for your kindness to my family and myself. Today I'm standing here because I'm in a free world. Yet, my family in China, as well as tens of thousands of my fellow countrymen, are still in an authoritarian regime. They are not free. Like the Freedom Tower behind me, it's still under construction. But it won't take long. We need to raise our efforts to help them. The world experienced great changes in the past 6 months. Following the Arabic Spring, Burma strides forward towards democracy. With its leader, Tong Sen, ordering the releasing of 518 political dissidents, Cuba has finally loosened up its restriction for citizens traveling abroad. Unfortunately, the human rights situation in China is in fact getting worse. This has to garner more attention from the world. And the United States in particular, as a beacon of freedom, needs to play a leading role. The nations in the world should shift their focus from trade to human rights. The Chinese government made a promise to me, to the United States of America, and to the world to have a thorough investigation of those persecuting me and my family in Shandong province for the past several years, and to make the decision public. Yet they have not kept their word. Because I fled the country, the government officials have enacted revenge on my nephew Chen Kegui and others. Chen Kegui tried to defend my family, but he was arrested and is still in jail today. The corrupted officials who ordered his arrest, however, got promoted. To this day, there has been no news that the Communist Party leaders are willing to change and do the right thing. They are posing a challenge to humanity, justice, and our conscience. On many sensitive days, citizens of conscience in Beijing and other first-tier cities were made to disappear in case they organized any activities.
Now, the practice has extended to the third cities. Tirsen Wooster and Liu Feiyue were made to disappear. So was Liu Guohui of Shandong province. In society without rule of law, the citizens have no sense of security. Li Wangyang was killed, yet said to have a suicide, which made "I will not commit suicide" a new mantra. And in fact, in China, no one is safe. Liu Xia, Hu Jia, Wang Lihong, Jiang Tianyong, Xu Zhiyong, Zheng Enchong, Feng Zhenghu, Liu Ping, and these people and many more, under the name of rule of law, have been harassed or illegally detained for too long. Hada, Song Ze, Ga Zhihui's 8-year-old son and the family vanished without a trace. The Communist Party officials at every level continue to act against the state law and humanity. Which part of China's law gives the Communist Party such special power? How can you rule the country with justice when you yourself are crooked? Dear Mr. Xi Jinping, the whole nation is watching you. Whether you will follow the call of heaven and the people to carry out a reform, or kidnap the government and maintain the power of the Communist Party, it is a matter whether China will have the transition in a peaceful way or a violent way. Do not send out the wrong signal to party officials that they can continue acting without any restraint. Do not support the ongoing message that anyone urging them to abide by their own laws will be treated as a state enemy. Aung San Suu Kyi is free now. When will Liu Xia, Hu Jia, Wang Lihong, Jiang Tianyong, and the above-mentioned people be free as well? Tyson set his political dissidents free. What about Gao Zhisheng, Liu Xiaobo, Guo Quan, Yang Xingshui, Li Yunan, Uyghur Christian Ali Mujiang, and Qi Chonghuai? When will these prisoners of conscience be released? Tyson's open mind won his support from the Burmese people and recognition from the world. If Tyson can do this, yet Xi Jinping doesn't, obviously it is not that she couldn't do it, but simply that he wouldn't, and that will speak volumes to who he is as a person and as a leader. And if that is the case, how can one expect him to restore power to the people, or to carry out the reform and maintain social justice? Nowadays, people who defend their rights are abducted and illegally detained. People like Mao Hengfeng, Wang Kuma, Shen Peilan, and Jin Yuehua are sent to labor camps or detention centers. The violence in maintaining China's one-child policy still extensively exists. It is a sign, because life is sacred. The number of self-immolation in Tibet sees almost a daily increase and has exceeded 80 deaths. The persecution of Falun Gong people and house church continues. Under the name of maintaining stability, all the while the red terror envelopes the nation, black jail all over the country. The stubborn force of Chinese authorities has shown its true face, declaring, "I have to stay above the constitution and the law. What can you do to stop me? I am in power." How can the international community turn a blind eye to the crimes committed by the Chinese Communist Party in maintaining its power? How can the leaders of the free world keep silent, watching the blood and the tears of fellow human beings flow? How can world leaders remain unmoved? Citizens of the world, let your voice be heard in support of justice. And the people of China, we are capable and ought to join together to work for our own rights. We can rely on our own actions to establish and maintain a fair and just social system. Don't expect some good emperor to bestow the right upon us, or some upright officials to defend our rights. God help those who help themselves. Our fate is actually in our own hands. Here, I would also like to call upon our Tibetan brothers and sisters. Please cherish life and do not choose the path of self-immolation. Our struggle cannot go forever, and I know that there is a solution out there. Let us work together to find it, shall we? Human Rights Day belongs to each and every one of us on this planet. Each individual has his or her rights, and these rights should be respected. As human beings, we should take actions to vigilantly improve and defend human values. It is to benefit our long-term and most essential interests and needs, not just through words, but more importantly, through action. As Human Rights Day is drawing near, let us put in all our efforts to defend human rights. Thank you.
China today. After 30 years of economic reform, we remain very surprised. The expectation had been that China would gradually move towards political reform following economic reforms. There is no such political reform being discussed in China today. So in fact, it's gone retrograde as far as even what was happening 30 years ago. There is, I think, important factors that need to also be stressed as far as the increasing difficulty of any significant systematic political reform. There are fears of accountability within the system itself. What would happen if there was an open, transparent system to analyze accountability within the system? That is a factor that I think is going to impede that sort of open reform. This is giving rise to an intensifying conflict between the party state authorities and civil society, which is intensifying week by week, month by month. And it's in this context, I think, that we have to understand the system of law in China and what we sort of call the rule of law. Overall, our assessment is that law is not above politics in China. So politics still remains supreme, and this is evident in the design of the of the legal system, in the conception and the institutions of law. Give supremacy to political authority at every level of the system. So institutionally, there are committees which are referred to as political and legal committees that determine the legal procedures, determine sentences often, and courts are subordinated to those committees. So overall, structurally, the law is not independent in China, and this is evident in the functioning of individual courts. There are, of course, judges who are trying to exercise their autonomy, but overall they are having to face a structural system in which courts do not have an independent position. This is also the context in which we have to understand human rights violations in the system. As civil society in China pushes the boundaries and expects more, the conflicts with the party state are intensifying. So the individuals who are politically suspect in the view of the political authorities have expanded tremendously. So it's not the usual now just the political activists that we know well from the past, the well-known activists, but now those who are politically suspect and are viewed as dangerous by the party state have expanded greatly. We are now seeing simple bloggers who are, have posted messages that are inherently not political, being sentenced, being deprived of their liberty. And we are seeing from day to day the increase in such cases. The Chinese have definitely on paper made some improvements in the law. So formally, China has advanced in creating a body of law. They have come from a time 30 years ago when there was really almost no law. There were no judges, there were no lawyers. So we need to recognize that in 20 or 30 years, there has been important progress in that respect. There are issues with the particular laws that they are implementing, but overall, China has introduced a body of law. The problem remains largely with the implementation or the actual non-implementation of the law. And this is where we need to focus our attentions on the fact that despite the blueprint of an fairly reasonable body of law, that the implementation is very problematic. So I'll talk just briefly about some of the ways in which the law itself is violated in practice. Increasing numbers of people are being held without charge, in arbitrary detention, in some cases days, in some cases weeks, in some cases months and even years in arbitrary detention, with no judicial process, no judicial review. Increasing numbers of people are being held in locations that are not official places of detention. I will talk a little bit about black jails. These are intended for petitioners who are seeking justice for their individual situation. There's also called legal education centers, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. But the government has established centers of detention which operate completely outside of the formal process.
MEP at that time, and Mr. Dr. Matas was the co-author of this study. We based our debate on this study, and I think it would be very interesting now to hear new aspects and new elements of research and evidence accumulated on that issue. So, Dr. Matas, if you could brief us on that issue. Thank you.
Yes, I'm happy to do so. The overwhelming proportion of organs for transplants in China comes from prisoners. The government of China acknowledges that this is so and accepts that the sourcing of organs for transplants from prisoners is ethically wrong. The government in March 2012 committed to ending the reliance on prisoners for organs in 5 years. The government in September of this year further indicated that this phasing out would start in the coming year, 2013. Sourcing of organs from prisoners has been done without consent, and again the government has acknowledged that this is so. The position of the government of China is that the prisoners who are the sources of organs are all sentenced to death. Yet, in reports published in June 2006, January 2007, in a book, Bloody Harvest, November 2009, all of which I co-authored with David Kilgore, and in a book, State Organs, August 2012, just this year, I co-edited with Torsten Trey, we concluded that the bulk of prisoners who are the sources of organs are prisoners of conscience. Mostly practitioners of the spiritually based set of exercises, Falun Gong, sentenced to nothing, but other prisoners of conscience as well. Now, I did prepare a written text for today, which is a lot longer than the text I intend to develop, and it's at the table, and people can take a look at it. In that text, I talk about the nature of Falun Gong, how it came to be banned, and some of the elements of evidence that led to the conclusion to which we came, including the medical testing to which Ms. Francis has referred. We also look at statistics for transplants and death penalties throughout the years, and the mismatch between the volume of transplants and the volume of executions. And that evidence is there in great detail for people to look at and evaluate. But what I wanted to do very briefly now is to propose to this committee ways to combat Chinese government abuse of global transplant ethics. And I have 4 specific suggestions to make. One of them is extraterritorial legislation. Legislation prohibiting the knowing purchase and sale of organs should be given extraterritorial scope so that Europeans who buy and sell organs abroad can be prosecuted in Europe for organ trafficking. The legislation should encompass brokers as well as purchasers and sellers. There's examples of such legislation already introduced in Canada and in Belgium, and in the written text I describe that proposed legislation in detail. Secondly, the European Parliament should endorse legislation requiring mandatory reporting of transplant tourism. European patients who have had transplants abroad need aftercare in Europe. Health professionals in Europe will inevitably know of transplants abroad. Compulsory reporting would work hand in hand with extraterritorial legislation against organ trafficking, enhancing its enforcement. Again, there's legislation in France proposing this change, and I describe it in the written text. Third, pharmaceutical companies should not conduct clinical trials of anti-rejection drugs in China where the sources of organs are prisoners. Precautions need to be put in place to prevent that from happening. Some pharmaceutical companies, to their credit, have voluntarily pulled away from these Chinese trials because of ethical concerns. Nonetheless, there's still room for regulation in the area. There needs to be explicit requirements to discourage the sort of pharmaceutical trials of anti-rejection drugs which have been taking place in China. Fourth, the European health insurance systems should not pay for transplants abroad where the transplants occur in circumstances which would violate European legal standards. And European law needs to say that. Again, I give an example from Israel where such legislation was passed. In conclusion, I would say that I noticed, as the chair did, that there were hearings on this issue in December 2009 where my colleague David Kilgore spoke. The European Parliament passed a resolution in May 2010, an action plan, and one of the components of the action plan, and I quote, is, it says, notes the report of David Matas and David Kilgore about the killing of members of Falun Gong for their organs and asks the Commission to present a report on these allegations along with other such cases to the European Parliament and to the Council. The Commission, 2.5 years later, has presented no such report, and I suggest the committee urge it to do so. If one looks at the tabulations or statistics of human rights violations in China in terms of arbitrary detention or torture, Falun Gong are by far the #1 victims of human rights violations in China. In principle, the worst victims need to be given the most attention, the highest priority. The European Parliament should follow that principle when addressing human rights violations in China. I was pleased to see the European Union won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2012. That award, I suggest, can and should continue to be justified by a focus on organ transplant abuse in China, the victimization of prisoners of conscience, and in particular Falun Gong. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Matis.